everyone. This is Amy from the North Columbus Public Library, and thank you for joining me today. Today we have a special guest. Her name is Ashley Brantley, and she is the local Columbus office of the University of Georgia Extension Services. She will be giving a talk on raised bed gardening. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and talk to Ashley. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, and hello everyone. As Amy mentioned, my name is Ashley Brantley, and I am the UGA Extension Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent here in Muskogee County. And today I wanted to talk to you a little bit about raised bed gardening. Now, raised bed gardening can be more for your ornamental plants such as shrubs and flowers, but today I wanted to specifically focus on food crops, fruit and vegetable production. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with raised bed gardening. And we're going to take a quick look at things like location, types, materials, bed construction, soil, and plants before really moving on to planting, care and maintenance. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with a few tips just to have a successful raised bed garden. So what is raised bed gardening? Well, it is actually a freestanding form that we use for planting that is above the ground level. Now keep in mind, this may or may not be a contained structure or form. And so gardeners actually find this as a really viable option when in-ground gardening or your typical gardening practices are not feasible. And that's for several reasons, whether you are restricted on space, if you have poor soil quality or drainage, or you have physical restrictions that can make gardening difficult. So, of course, there are some other advantages to raised bed gardening as well, such as having an extended growing season in that the soil just warms up faster in the spring and allows you for earlier planting and faster plant growth. Many gardeners often find that these particular types of gardens are easier or simpler to manage because of ease of access, and also it requires less maintenance for some gardeners, such as dealing with compaction issues or things like weeds. Most gardeners often find that they have higher production using these types of beds due to the closer planting spaces, and also there's more room for root growth and development. So whatever your reason for starting a raised bed garden, you want to make sure that you really begin small, especially if this is your first time really jumping into gardening. Of course, with everything, you want to make sure that you have a plan. What do you plan on planting? When are you going to plant? Where are you going to construct your raised bed? Make sure that you are growing vegetables that you and your family enjoys and that they love. And last but not least, you really want to make sure that you have the right foundation for your raised bed garden. Really take some time to figure out the best location, the materials that you're going to use, the soil, etc. So a vital component to having a good foundation is location. Where do you have space? Is this going to be in your backyard next to your patio, or maybe it's in your front yard closer to the street? Know your plant's requirements. And this is really important because most of our fruits and vegetables that we grow, especially if they produce a fruit, like say a tomato or a squash or an eggplant, these actually require quite a few hours of full sunlight in the day to be productive. Specifically, they need 6 or more hours in the day. So it really needs to be a really sunny spot. Whereas if you're growing more cool season vegetables, things like lettuces or cabbage or collard greens, where you're growing these for more of their leaf structures, you can typically get away with a few more hours, anywhere from 3 to 5. So you really, again, want to go back to your specific plant's requirements for growth and development. Make sure that you also have access to water. One of the drawbacks to raised bed gardening is that they tend to dry out a little bit faster than in-ground gardens. And so you really want to make sure that you have that water source close by, because these will need some additional watering, especially in the hotter months. And then lastly, you want to make sure that your garden is visible from your home. And that is because, as you can imagine, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind, which is not good when you're trying to grow food crops. There are certain issues that you can deal with, from underwatering, overwatering, but also pest and disease issues too. And if you can keep an eye on your garden, it'll be easier to catch some of these things on the forefront. So with raised beds, there's actually two types to choose from depending on your goals and what particular resources you have available. And the first one we're going to look at today is temporary beds. As we mentioned earlier, with raised beds, these are where these particular growing structures are where the soil is above ground level. Of course, it's loose and easy to work with. As you can imagine, with the temporary, there is no permanent structure or framework for these particular beds. And so they're really simple in nature, and they require less initial labor on the forefront to construct these beds. However, one of the drawbacks to the temporary beds is that they tend to flatten over time. The soil doesn't remain in that raised form. And so after the growing season, typically these need to be reworked just to get them back in the raised bed form. Now, the next one we're going to look at are permanent raised beds. These actually help control soil loss that you can often have happen with temporary beds, because there's nothing that contains that soil. This also allows for deeper soil amendment too. And so, in hindsight, when using temporary, that less initial upfront cost. With permanent, however, because you are building a structure for these, you will have a higher upfront cost, because these are permanent beds and you will have materials, again, to keep that soil contained. However, they can last for several years depending on the material that you use, so that kind of helps offset that. And oftentimes these can be a visual interest in your landscape. And because the preference for many gardeners is to use this second type of raised bed, more permanent structure, this is the one that we're going to be focusing on the most today in the talk. So for majority of gardeners, the structure of the raised bed is really going to be heavily dependent on the material that you have available. It's also going to depend on how these beds are built or constructed, and then what budget you have, how much you have available to spend on these particular materials. Some of the most common framing materials for these permanent raised bed structures include things like wood, old railroad ties, blocks, brick, and rock. And so essentially, anything that really helps contain that soil into a structure that is stable can be used to construct a raised bed. Now, concerns over using old railroad tires and treated wood have been raised over the years when it comes to specifically growing food crops. However, recent research has shown that these do not appear to pose a health concern when used for raised beds. However, if you're unsure or just a little apprehensive about using these materials for your raised bed, you can kind of circumvent that by using a plastic liner in between the material that you use to construct your walls and the soil. And so it just kind of creates a barrier. However, if you do end up using a plastic liner, you'll want to make sure that it doesn't line the bottom of your bed as well, because that can lead to some drainage issues down the road. So whatever material you choose, you want to make sure that it's sturdy and that it's able to hold the soil, but also that it's long lasting, so you're not having to go back in every so often and replace some of those materials. Now, keep in mind that the pricing of the beds will vary depending on the materials that you use. Wood, of course, is going to be more on the lower end as far as expense goes, whereas stone, on the other hand, is going to be more on the expensive side. So as you may have guessed, raised beds will vary in the size and shape. However, most times when you see a raised bed, they're often rectangular or square, and that really goes back to the materials that are being used. Some of the most common sizes we see with raised beds are 4x4, 4x8, 4x12. As you can see, that 4-foot increment, and that goes back again to the materials being used. And so oftentimes for width, you'll see anywhere from 3 to 4 feet, and this just really allows for ease of access. So one of the advantages of growing in raised beds is that you don't have to actually step into the bed to be able to work it. And so at these widths, you're typically able to get your arm in the bed without having to step in. So that's where that ease of access comes in. As far as the length goes, again, it's really mostly dependent on the material that is being used. Especially with wood, they come again in 4-foot increments. And so you just want to make sure that when it comes to length, it's easy to maneuver around, especially if you have more than one bed. And so typically with raised beds, the soil should be anywhere from 8 to 12 inches. And this is just to make sure that you have proper root growth and development, but that it also allows for proper drainage. And so on top of all that, you can actually add features to your beds that help increase accessibility, but also convenience. So things like seating, you can do ramps for equipment, or supports for things like cold frames or trellises. So several things that you can add that just make your beds a little more accessible for you, so you can garden with ease. So now that we've looked at location and materials, the first step before really getting out there and laying out the perimeter of your bed is to make sure that you remove any vegetation that might be in the spot where you are planning to construct your bed. You really don't want that barrier under your bed that will hinder root growth, but also drainage and things like that can be an issue down the road. And so there's really several ways that you can go about doing this. The first one, of course, is using herbicides, but you can also use covering or physical means, whatever you find will be most convenient for you. And so that once this existing vegetation is removed, you really want to make sure that you have a level site for construction. And so when it comes to construction, for most of our raised beds, these are going to be typically held in place by stakes. And these stakes should be at least twice the height of the bed, because half of that stake is actually going to be buried in the ground. Now, if you're using wooden stakes for this, you really want to make sure that they're decay resistant, because again, half of that stake is going to be buried in the ground. Now, if you are using railroad ties or landscape timbers, typically these are held in place by rebar. There are holes drilled in the material, and these bars are slipped in the holes, and it just really helps give these beds some stability. Now, if you are using stone or blocks, as long as the walls are less than 2 feet tall, you really don't need to have footings or mortar applied to this. These will stay pretty sturdy without. However, if your walls are going to be higher than 2 feet, you really want to consider using either footings or mortar to help keep those materials in place. Now, if you are constructing more than one bed, you really need to think through pathways for access to your beds. And so typically you can get away with 1 foot in between your beds. That's enough for walking in between. However, if you have multiple beds and you are needing to get wheelbarrows around them or carts, you want to make sure that your pathways are anywhere from 3 to 4 feet wide, especially if these beds need to be wheelchair accessible as well. You want to make sure that your pathways are an appropriate size for a wheelchair to get in between to be able to allow for ease of access. Now, before you fill your bed with soil, you've already removed that existing vegetation. You want to make sure that you're really roughing up that native soil or the soil that is under the bed. And this is because this is going to allow for roots to grow from the soil that's in the raised bed into the existing soil. This will also help with drainage down the road. But also, if you don't rough up that soil, it actually kind of creates a barrier for water to penetrate, but also the roots as well. And so once you get that roughed up, you really want to mix in a couple of inches of the soil that you plan on including in your raised bed with that native soil too. Again, that just kind of helps with drainage, but also for root penetration or root growth. Again, you don't want to have barriers for either one of those reasons. All right, so now that we have our beds constructed, let's look at soil or what you're going to use to fill your beds with. And so one of the main advantages for using raised beds for gardening is that you have the ability to include or use what we like to think of as new soil or amended soil. So you're not using the native soil that might not have the properties that you are looking for. And so this really just helps in areas where, again, you have certain issues that may be things like compaction or poor drainage or just poor soil quality in general. And so the soil or the mix that you use in your raised beds really needs to be twofold. So it needs to be able to hold water well, especially since raised beds are known for drying out faster than in-ground gardens, but it also needs to have decent drainage as well. And so again, there's two sides to this coin. It needs to hold water, but it also needs to be able to drain. So as you can imagine, there are several options out there. And of course, prices will vary just like materials depending on what you decide to use. And so oftentimes, the most common one is topsoil, and some variation of that is used in most raised beds. You really want to make sure that if you purchase topsoil, that you purchase it from a reputable dealer. There's also commercial mixes available. There are some geared towards raised beds specifically, and these offer various combinations of things like compost, pine bark, peat moss, and you can actually figure out what's in your commercial mix by flipping the bag over and looking at the ingredients list. There's also amended or homemade mixes that you can make yourself. There's actually various recipes out there for doing this if you're interested. Just a quick Google search and you'll find that. I know there are several, again, out there available, especially through some of the extension offices as well. And so typically these are a combination of topsoil or just combinations of compost, pine bark mulch, and peat moss and or sand. And so again, various combinations out there depending on what you want to use. Something to keep in mind, though, is that soil and soil mixes are actually sold and delivered by the cubic yard. So you really want to make sure that you have your measurements down before you decide which soil or mix you're going to use. And really the easy way to do that is just multiplying your length by your height by your width of your raised bed, and then dividing that by 27, and then you can figure out how many cubic yards you need for your raised beds. All right, so now that our beds are together, let's look at plants that can be grown in a raised bed. And so when you're looking at plants for a raised bed, really most of the vegetables that you can grow in an in-ground garden will also do well in a raised bed. And so just a few that do really well include things like tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, lettuce, things of that nature. Keep in mind that if you plan on growing things like cucumbers or pole beans, things that run or spread, you really want to make sure that you have plenty of space for these. And this is where trellises or support structures can really come in handy and free up some space for you. And so when it comes down to it, really, you just want to make sure that you are choosing cultivars that are really suited for your area. And a good way to know if they are suited for our particular area here in Columbus or in Georgia in general is to check with your local extension office. We have resources here that can point you in the right direction. So when you're choosing plants for your garden, you of course want to make sure whether it's seeds or transplants that these are disease-free and healthy. And so something to keep in mind, you can actually go out and purchase your own transplants, but you can also grow your own from seed. Make sure again that you're purchasing these from a reputable nursery or garden center. And if you are purchasing transplants, make sure that they are not weak or appear stressed. Make sure that they look healthy. And keep in mind that certain vegetables will need to be direct seeded. They don't do so well as transplants. My transplants, as you can see on this picture here on the right, it's just miniature plants that you can go ahead and buy or again grow yourself before planting them in your garden. And so a few of the ones that don't do well as transplants, they don't really like having their roots disturbed, are things like beans, peas, and root crops. So by root crops, we are talking about things that you actually eat the roots, like beets or carrots or radishes. Again, they really don't like having their roots disturbed, and so it's actually best to sow seeds for these directly into the garden. Now, if you do decide to use seed, whether for planting directly into the garden or for growing your own transplants, you really want to make sure that you take a look at the information on the back of the seed packet. This is really important to know things like the sow schedule. As I was mentioning earlier, you really want to make sure that these plants are suitable for your area, and knowing when to plant them outside in the garden is really helpful. And that's where this map of the U.S. comes in, and it tells you when is the best time to sow these seeds based on your area. You really need to know the depth of the seed, how deep it needs to be sown. Spacing between plants is really important. You want to make sure that these plants have the space that they need, again, for proper growth and development. It's really helpful too to know the days to germination and to harvest, so you can have that on your calendar. Knowing any specific growth requirements that these plants have. And then lastly, the last tidbit of information you really need to check out is the dates that the seeds were packed. Make sure that you're purchasing seeds within the current year. If the seeds are older than the current year, it's not to say that they will not germinate for you, but over time, the rate of germination and plant vigor that you get from these seeds will decrease. And so you really want to make sure that you're using current seeds for the year, so you can make sure that you have good germination and good plant vigor. So if you are growing seeds for transplants, make sure that you're starting them when the seed packet recommends. Typically, this is anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks out before you plan on planting them in the garden. And so keep in mind that the best mix for starting these seeds is actually a soilless mix. And there's also pea pots or pellets that can be used. These are really great options for seeds or plants that do not like to have their roots disturbed. So you can grow them in the little pots or pellets and then plant them directly in the garden. You never have to really disturb those roots. And then after sowing, you really want to make sure that you're placing these seeds in a warm space that receives plenty of sunlight, so you're not getting leggy transplants that are actually weak in nature and won't do as well in your garden. Again, all of this information can be found on the back of your seed packet as well. And so something I wanted to highlight before we moved on to planting was hardening off. And so once your seedlings develop 2 to 3 sets of true leaves, and by true leaves we mean the leaves the plant will have after it puts on those first set of seed leaves, and you can see in the picture below, it will take on its true leaf shape. So you want to make sure that you have 2 to 3 of those before placing those out in the garden. However, I mentioned hardening off, and so it's really important that you harden these transplants that you are growing off before you are planting them in the garden. Now, this goes for those that you grew yourself. So it means that they need to be acclimated before placing in the garden. Otherwise, they will be stressed by their new home or their new environment. You have to remember that these have been growing in a controlled environment, probably inside of your home, and so the outside is a little bit different. They have new temperature fluctuations dealing with the sunlight, wind, and things like that. And so this is just a really important step that most gardeners seem to forget about, but it really helps toughen up these plants before the growing season really gets underway. Now, when you're planting in raised beds, you really want to make sure that you're planting at the same time as that you would as an in-ground garden. Now, if you're unsure when this will be, you really want to make sure that you are looking at the back of your seed packet. You can find the information there. If you were purchasing transplants from a local garden center or nursery, you can find it on the little tag that comes in the seed tray or the transplant tray. Or you can, again, check here with the extension office. We actually have planting calendars, which are general dates for the state of Georgia. Now, something to keep in mind with raised bed gardens is oftentimes because the soil is above ground level, they do warm up faster. And so oftentimes you can get away with planting about 2 weeks earlier than you typically would with an in-ground garden. So to really make the most out of your raised bed and the space that it has available, but also to really get the most bang for your buck, most gardeners will use what we like to call a block planting system, which is where you are planting based on centers. And so for larger crops such as tomatoes or squash, this will be on 24-inch or 2-foot centers. Crops such as potatoes or corn will be on 1-foot centers or 12-inch centers. Medium crops, which are things like peas or onions, will be spaced about 6 inches apart. And then smaller crops will just be scattered throughout a certain section, and then they'll be thinned accordingly. But again, this is just to really make the most out of the space you have available. Instead of planting in rows, which are typically found in in-ground gardens, you're planting more on blocks. So you're blocking the raised beds into sections. So there's also other planting methods that can be used that will help you achieve your goals or your fullest potential for your garden. The first one is succession planting, which just means that you're staggering the planting times. This is really helpful for quick maturing crops or crops that have a one-time harvest, things like cabbage or cauliflower. And so they're not all ready at the same time, so you can have a longer time period of produce that you're harvesting. And again, you're not harvesting all at one time. There's also interplanting, which is the planting of compatible crops within each other to kind of help use up some of that space and get, again, more bang for your buck. And so lastly, it's really important to use stakes or trellises, especially if you're growing, again, some of those crops that like to scatter about, run, crawl. So you're not using up more of your space. You're getting those plants up and out of the way so you can get more plants in your bed. So watering is going to be really important with your raised bed, and that is because there is a drawback for using raised beds, and that is Yes, they drain great, but they will also dry out faster in warmer weather than in-ground gardens. And so you want to make sure that you are checking your beds frequently for water needs. If there is no rain, if we are going through a drought period, beds could need up to 2 inches of water per week to make sure that your plants are getting the water they need for proper growth and development. And so there are several options actually available to help assist with watering. You have things such as soaker hoses, drip irrigation, sprinklers, and they really have their own advantages and disadvantages, and what you have available will typically dictate what you end up using. Some gardeners like to get out there and check their garden daily, so they may hand water, but again, there are options out there to make sure that your plants are receiving the water that they need. Now, something to keep in mind, no matter which method you decide to go with as far as for covering your water needs for your raised beds, you really want to make sure that you're not overwatering. Again, you also don't want to underwater as well. But a lot of times what we see is that people overwater, and that can cause problems because that reduces airspace in your raised bed, and it can lead to decline of plant growth, which is just really what you don't want when you're growing food crops. So in addition to water, you will also want to make sure that you're paying attention to fertilization for your crops. This is actually very similar to the methods used for in-ground gardening. Now, if you end up using topsoil or a topsoil-based mix in your raised bed, you really want to make sure that you have the soil tested to see where your pH levels are, your nutrient levels are, and then to make sure that you are applying the levels that are recommended from your soil test. However, if you are using a homemade mix, most of the time these have fertilizer already added in them. You can go several months without having to apply fertilizer. However, down the road, you will have to consider adding some additional fertilizer, but again, that's months down the road, depending on what is used in your mix. Now, there are, of course, different options when it comes to fertilizer. There are the water-soluble ones, the ones that you mix with water and then you just water your plants. Or there are slow-release options where you actually mix into your soil, and so you don't have to worry about applying them through a water-based system. There's also inorganic and organic options depending on what your goals are. Now, whichever fertilizer you use, you really want to make sure that you follow the label instructions and directions. So please make sure that you are reading the back of your package and you are applying them based on what the material says to do, because there can be things that can lead to damage for your plants, and sometimes it can be too much fertilizer. Fertilizer can actually burn plants and roots, and that is what you don't want. So make sure, again, that you're following those label instructions. And the last thing I really wanted to highlight today when it comes to raised bed gardens is mulches. Mulches can be applied around plants, a 2 to 4 inch layer. Once that soil has warmed, it really just helps control weeds, but it also regulates soil temperature and it helps keep some of that moisture in as well, which is really beneficial when using with raised beds, which tend to dry out faster than, say, in-ground gardens. And so there are, of course, several options out there, such as pine straw. You can use old newspapers, compost, leaves, all work really well with raised bed gardens. So consider using a mulch if you can. And so just to wrap up, there are a few things to remember to really be successful with raised bed gardens. The first one is make sure that you are checking your beds regularly for water needs. As I mentioned, raised beds, because the soil is elevated above ground level, they do tend to dry out faster, and so these often need to be watered more regularly. Next, you want to make sure that you are inspecting your plants. This is where making sure that they are visible from your home really comes in handy, so you can get out there and check on things on a regular basis and hopefully cut off any potential pest or disease problems at the forefront. And then lastly, make sure that you're using the most out of your space in your season. And so again, using more of a blocking system instead of rows seems to be really beneficial when using raised beds. Again, you can get more out of that raised bed by making the most out of the space and the season as well. And so that is all I have for today. Thank you so much for having me, and I hope that everyone has a great gardening season. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Thank you so much, and I'm excited about the gardening season. And I was just thinking, that chart too on the best, times for planting, especially in this. I've heard some people talk about they're really excited to get back in there and start playing. And so I know March is always kind of it's like, but then there's always seems to be like that winter's last bites that might come through. So
right.
I appreciate all of the information.
Yeah. You really want to make sure that you wait until after that last frost day. And so you can actually Google it. And for Columbus, it's around April 1. So we generally recommend that you wait 1 to 2 weeks after that. So generally around tax date is when you can start planting. It's usually a safe time to kind of get out there for those warm season vegetables.
Okay. That's great. Thank you so much for that. One last question. Do you have any tips for small spaces?
Tips
like apartments or even
Yeah, container gardening is a great option for those who want to garden more but have really small spaces. And so there are several different options as far as containers go out there. So you can purchase containers. You can actually recycle some things that you have at home, such as cutting off milk jugs is a good one, or drinking containers, and like apple juices you can slice on the side and it actually makes a little container that you can use to garden in. And so for those areas, because they are limited on space, they can still garden, and containers is a good option for that. So
okay, awesome. Thank you.
yeah.
So, I think those are all the questions I have. And anyone, if you have any questions, just feel free to contact me at the UGA Extension Services, or feel free to contact the library, and I'll be sure to get you to Ashley. And I think that's all we have for today. Stay tuned. We'll give you just a couple of book highlights on what you can check out for free from the library that's related to raised bed gardening. And again, special thank you to Ashley, our guest speaker today.
Thank you for having me.
Hey everyone, so I wanted to invite you to check out some of the books that we have available for checkout. Here we have Urban Gardening for Beginners, Simple Hacks and Easy Projects for Growing Your Own Food in Small Spaces. This is by Mark Toma. And this is actually a fairly new book that just came out last year. And this is part of our popular materials collection, so be sure to request it. We also have Building Raised Beds, Easy Accessible Garden Space for Vegetables and Flowers. This is part of the Story Basics Books for Self-Reliance. And this is by Fern Marshall Bradley. And this is a kind of a short book, so it's not intimidating at all. And so I do check this one out. Next we have this super fun Grow Your Own Herbs, the 40 Best Culinary Varieties for Home Gardens. And this is by Susan Belsinger and Arthur O. Tucker. And I really enjoyed this book. For example, you can see here that there is just this one page on rosemary, and it gives you this beautiful picture of it. So again, it's almost more like a magazine, and it even has tips on cultivation, harvesting, preserving, and also for cooking as well. So this is a really cool book. Next, I have Easy Growing, Organic Herbs and Edible Flowers for Small Spaces. And this is by Gayla Trail. And this
just like the other book that I just showed you, has some really cool recipes in here. For example, there's flower pot cornbread. It's a little bit of southern touches in there in this book. And last but not least, we have Raised Bed Gardening, How to Grow More in Less Space. And this is by Simon Ackroyd. And kind of like the other books, this one is very picturesque, and it does also encourage you to use recycled materials when you're doing your raised bed gardening. So all these books are available for either curbside pickup, or if you want to come into the library, you're more than welcome to do that as well. If you have any questions, just give us a call at the North Columbus Public Library. Our number is 706-748-2855. And don't forget, you can also request online at cvlga.org. And you can also download our app as well. So thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this video finds you well, and hope to see you soon. Have a wonderful day.